Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm William Luther. I met many of you earlier. I'm director of the Sound Money Project here at the American Institute for Economic Research. And I'm very pleased to celebrate the launch of our new book, The Gold Standard, Retrospect and Prospect. This is the first book that the Sound Money Project has published with the American Institute for Economic Research, and I don't think I'm alone on the project in hoping that this is the first of many. The Sound Money Project was founded in 2009 by Alex Chalfin and tonight's speaker, Judy Shelton. The project is comprised of leading academics and practitioners in money, banking, and macroeconomics who conduct research and promote awareness about monetary stability and financial privacy. We offer regular commentary and in-depth analysis on monetary policy, alternative monetary systems, financial markets regulation, cryptocurrencies, and the history of monetary and macroeconomics. AIER has a much longer history, of course. It was founded in 1933 by Colonel E.C. Harwood, an economist and investment advisor. Harwood's mission was to educate people on the value of personal freedom, free enterprise, property rights, limited government, and sound money. It's a mission AIER continues to advance today. I first visited AIER in 2010 as a graduate student, not really knowing what to expect. I was met by friendly faces, eager to discuss the importance of private property, sound money, and the philosophy of knowledge. In our classroom, but also with a beer in hand, enjoying this incredible view. I returned the following year and would later push for the Sound Money Project to move to AIER when the opportunity arose in 2017. It's no surprise that the Sound Money Project has been such a great fit here at AIER, and our book, our new book, is a testament to that. It opens with a prologue written by the research staff at AIER on August 23, 1971, just 8 days after President Nixon closed the gold window. And we hope that those folks would view our work in the pages that follow as a continuation of the work that they began so many years ago. Of course, a book like this doesn't get written without a lot of help, so I want to take a moment to thank a few people. First, my co-editor, Peter Earle, who couldn't be with us tonight, but as I mentioned earlier, suggested that we put this book together to mark the 50th anniversary of the Nixon shock. The contributors, some of whom are here tonight, Larry White, Thomas Hogan, Brian Cutzinger, Alex Gleason, who some of you may have met, handled the production of the book, and my wife Tom, who is incredibly supportive. So thank you all. Our mission is to educate. And writing books about the gold standard is unfortunately not a profitable enterprise. Fortunately, we have the very generous support of AIER donors who make it possible to spread our ideas far and wide. In particular, I would like to thank Wes McCain, Steve Dewey, John Cash, Robert and Ann Miller, Bruce Rodenberger, and Jerry Stein. We could not do this without your support, so thank you very much. Lastly, I would like to thank Stanley Stillman, who has been a close friend and a champion of the Sound Money Project, and has the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker. So please join me in welcoming Stanley Stillman.
Good evening, and may I add, what a coalition of forces allied in front of me. For a fuller introduction to tonight's speaker, may I refer you to the program notes. As my introduction, let me suggest that each of us has a story about being here. Even a few, I dare say, knew Colonel Harwood in his time. All of us here, nevertheless, even a few skeptics, are either committed to or curious about a single idea, the virtues of a fixed exchange rate regime to govern both domestic and international monetary policy. In a sense, we have a fixed exchange rate regime domestically in the 50 states of our union, but we don't have one on a global basis as existed in the middle of the 19th century. An international monetary policy based, may I emphasize, on a measure reflecting the advances, what can also be referred to as the progress over the ages in human ingenuity, instead of the decisions of experts. Before this audience, do I need to name the best measure of such ingenuity? If any remain puzzled, our speaker tonight will explain. This briefly is my story. As a student, some 60 years ago, learned about an article in Fortune magazine, July 1961, "The West is risking a credit collapse," by Jacques Rueff. Who, some of you will ask, is Jacques Rueff? For an up-to-date who's who, none better, I suggest, than an online comment by Larry White, an advisor to the Sound Money Project here. The End, just published, "The End of Bretton Woods, Jacques Rueff, and the Monetary Sin of the West." As a quick snapshot, Rueff was the architect of the French government's policies under de Gaulle in the late 60s to convert the dollars then accumulating in the French central bank into gold. As a correspondent for Time, I then met Jacques Rueff on a number of occasions in the early 70s when he would come here to the United States. In 1975, as a guest of the Mont Pelerin Society at its meeting in Hillsdale, I witnessed Jacques Rueff take issue with none other than Milton Friedman and the floating exchange rate regime that had already emerged in the international monetary system, even before the Nixon shock and the closing of the gold window that occurred now 50 years ago tomorrow. As a friend of the Sound Money Project that Will referred to, then with Atlas Network, meeting Judy Shelton for lunch at Gill and Hers farm on the northern neck of Virginia, this time 8 years ago. And then subsequently attended the Sound Money Project event to launch its publication of, this is my principal prop, Notes on the Establishment of a Money Unit by none other than Thomas Jefferson, the foreword to which she had written. When 4 years later, the Sound Money Project moved from Atlas Network, learning about the American Institute of Economic Research. Some 2 years later, now 2 years ago, learning of the prominent mention of Jacques Rueff in the October 1980 issue of AIER's Economic Bulletin, Plans to Revive the Gold Standard. Converging in my story, I suggest, are the ideas of two forceful figures from the previous century, close contemporaries, Colonel Harwood and Jacques Rueff. While conceived separately in the bitter experience of the Great Depression some 90 years ago, their ideas are singular in purpose. While conceived separately, they are singular in purpose. What is now allied here as individuals and the organizations they represent to promote the truth of their ideas is a coalition of what I call forces, a coalition of forces. First, the American Institute of Economic Research, its energy, financial resources, staff, committed to fulfilling the legacy of Colonel Harwood. Then the AIER's Sound Money Project, with the energy, curiosity of a younger generation of scholars under the leadership of Will Luther and the watchful eye of Larry White. Also here represented the Liberty Fund of Carmel, Indiana, with its energy, financial resources, and staff. Leonidas Zelmanovitz and Sean Shelby are in this audience, and their commitment to publish an English translation of Jacques Rueff's L'ordre social, the social order, Rueff's philosophical reflections on how inflation sows disorder in human social systems. MPS 2021, a regional meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in Guatemala, November 14 to 18, that the rector of the University Marroquin, Gabriel Casada, is directing, on behalf of whom I can speak, with its intent to recognize Jacques Rueff's ideas in its upcoming program. Finally, not quite finally, I have launched a periodic online news digest from a Rueffian perspective to report what's new in the international monetary system. Finally, and not least, Judy Shelton, who has learned the gift to articulate the truth of the ideas of Harwood and Rueff to such a broad audience the major news media can no longer ignore. Converging here on this mountaintop in the Berkshires to consider the gold standard, retrospect, and prospect, in other words, is a coalition of forces determined to carry the day in time, just as Keynes's notions of reserve currencies did over Rueff's objections at the International Monetary Conference in Genoa in 1922. With the necessary cooperation, dare I suggest, of China and Russia, not to mention a broad, disparate range of other nation states and their respective central banks. Now, no better to put a stamp on this coalition than tonight's speaker. Judy. I have to add a note here. This book is in blue. And back in 1971, shall we say, that when Mao was still in the students were carrying around a little red book by Mao, I'm saying to myself, maybe what we should do with this book is reduce it in size and carry it around. It's a very, very powerful message, and a book published by the Sound Money Project. Do we not have one just now published?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It is my great pleasure to be here with you. I am honored that you invited me to speak on this very notable occasion, the 50-year anniversary of the closing of the gold window by President Nixon. And I am excited and inspired by the release of your new publication, The Gold Standard, Retrospect and Prospect. It could not have arrived at a more propitious moment, given the growing doubts about the wisdom of discretionary monetary policy carried out through central banks versus the appeal of decentralized finance, and rising public interest in alternative currencies. I appreciate being in this beautiful and exquisitely private setting. This all has great personal meaning for me, as my own career has spanned from doing scholarly research to putting forward policy proposals to suffering political persecution. No, I'm just kidding. The nomination process was very interesting, but I'm still standing. And I had to wear the dress. But there's a cautionary tale here for all of us who would draw lessons from prior monetary systems linked to gold and try to harness the virtues of those systems towards figuring out how to better calibrate the supply of money and credit to the needs of the real economy. I have always said, and stated repeatedly during my nomination hearing before the Senate Banking Committee last year, that the goal is to have money that facilitates productive economic growth. And well, my fellow gold bugs, we all know how dangerous a position one finds oneself in when one is described as an advocate for the gold standard. Will Luther, and again, thank you so much for inviting me. I am very pleased and proud that the Sound Money Project is housed here at the American Institute for Economic Research under your directorship. William had such an important article in the Wall Street Journal last week, together with Alex Salter. Congratulations to you both. But what William and Alex know so well, what Larry White knows, what Stanley Stillman knows, what Lou Lehrman knows, what Steve Forbes knows, what President Reagan found out when he couldn't convince his brain trust of economic advisors to support what his heart told him was the right approach to restoring sound money. What they all learned is that the mere mention of gold convertibility evokes not only dismissiveness from the academic world, but outright hostility, which is as mystifying as it is ludicrous. Somehow there is this scholarly conceit out there, which is quickly embraced by editorial writers everywhere, except very fortunately at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Sun. But this general notion exists that it is provincial, crude even, to discuss the gold standard and its valuable lessons, which is so silly and so ignorant. The most sophisticated practitioners of monetary policy, the most legendary central bankers, Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, were not only conversant about gold-linked monetary systems, but also, if I dare say, advocates. And Nobel Prize winners, Robert Mundell, Milton Friedman, for that matter. I first got to know Paul Volcker in 1994 at an event commemorating the 50-year anniversary of the beginning of the Bretton Woods system. That is, it was the 50-year anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference that took place in New Hampshire in July 1944. I got to know Paul rather well over the years because he regularly attended the annual International Monetary Conference held by Bob Mundell in Siena, Italy, which I later came to co-chair with Bob in his final years. Paul Volcker was a big believer in Bob Mundell's idea that global monetary reform should be pursued. In January 2000, Paul wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times entitled, "Toward a Single World Currency to Level the Playing Field." Here's what he wrote, quote, "My sense is that if we are to have a truly globalized economy with free movement of goods, services, and capital, a world currency makes sense. That would be a world in which the objectives of growth, economic efficiency, and stability could be reconciled," unquote. Paul Volcker was present with Nixon at Camp David on that weekend 50 years ago today, when the decision was made to close the gold window. He was Treasury Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs at the time. Volcker assumed that it would be a temporary closing, as Nixon said in his speech. Volcker thought the convertibility rate, $35 per ounce of gold, needed to be adjusted upward. He wasn't exactly sure by how much, but he never expected that the Bretton Woods international monetary system would be abandoned in favor of having no international monetary system. And in fact, in 2014, he gave a speech entitled "A New Bretton Woods" with 3 question marks. As far as Alan Greenspan, I've likewise had the privilege of knowing him for decades, with many opportunities to discuss at length with him exactly this topic, the role of gold in calibrating the money supply for optimal economic performance. In fact, when I was finishing up Money Meltdown back in November 1993, I got into a bit of a tiff with Alan Greenspan over wanting to include in my manuscript selected portions of his published writings from the Ayn Rand collection of articles called Capitalism, the Unknown Idea. Turns out, Greenspan personally held the trademark. And as chairman of the Federal Reserve, which he was at the time, he was reluctant to draw undue attention to his 1966 article, which was contained in that volume, and which is entitled "Gold and Economic Freedom." I'm pretty sure people in this select group are familiar with it. Greenspan's article starts off with this observation: an almost hysterical antagonism toward the gold standard is one issue which unites statists of all persuasions. They seem to sense, perhaps more clearly and subtly than many consistent defenders of laissez-faire, that gold and economic freedom are inseparable, that the gold standard is an instrument of laissez-faire, and that each implies and requires the other. In order to understand the source of their antagonism, it is necessary first to understand the specific role of gold in a free society, which he proceeds to do rather beautifully, concluding that in the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation, and that this is the shabby secret of the welfare statist tirades against gold, because deficit spending is simply a scheme for the hidden confiscation of wealth, and gold stands in the way of this insidious process. It stands as a protector of property rights, unquote. Well, we had quite an animated discussion in his office at the Fed about my wanting to quote him. I said it was important for someone in his position, imperative really, to expound on these views, assuming he still had them, which he assured me he did. But he pointed to his desk and his leather chair and all the computer terminals with bond rates and currency exchange rates and the latest financial market movements hopping around on their screens, covering markets all over the world. And he impressed upon me that his words as head of the U.S. Central Bank carried implications these days with potential consequences, such that he hoped I would understand. And I kind of did. I ended up telling him that I would paraphrase his prior statements in my book, in the final manuscript, but would provide the exact references in the notes so that anyone could look up the citations and confirm his words. I also told him I would personally deliver the first copy of my book, Money Meltdown, once it was published, to him right there in his office, to which he responded by saying, "Thank you," and then requested that I please cover it with brown paper. Seriously, he did. He can be quite witty. He said I shouldn't be walking down the halls of the Fed with a book that says Money Meltdown. And I don't think I've ever told that story to anyone other than my husband. You know, in preparing for this occasion and thinking about what I might say, it's turned out to be a very reflective experience. I found myself digging up old letters and emails to gain perspective. As a postscript to that Greenspan incident, let me share with you an email exchange with Alan that took place much more recently in July 2019, about a week after President Trump had tweeted out his intention to nominate me for the Fed Board of Governors. A particularly nasty opinion article had just come out that morning in the Washington Post entitled, "Judy Shelton is a dangerous pick for the Fed Board." It accused me of using the terms sound money and dependable dollar as code words, I kid you not, aimed at the, quote, crank right-wing fringe, that it was a, quote, wink to her fellow gold bugs because her radical vision involves replacing the Fed's mandate of stable prices and maximum employment with a gold standard, which it declared is roundly rejected by economists and was abandoned ages ago worldwide for good reason. My email to Greenspan that morning said, "Dear Alan, I am noting an almost hysterical antagonism toward the gold standard these days." Sound familiar? He wrote back, "Dear Judy, interesting times. If gold is such a worthless metal, then why does the US government and all other major governments hold so much of it in storage? Best, Alan." Coming from a former chairman of the US Federal Reserve, that would seem to be a rather meaningful observation. What I want to convey is this. Individuals who have actually been in the monetary policy arena at the top levels of central banking do understand the implications of gold in governments, even if it's the rare academic who appreciates the nuances. In that context, I have to mention one other notable exchange. My husband will remember the occasion. We were in Paris, having dinner with Bob Mundell, and discussing a speech that French President Sarkozy had just given, calling for new monetary arrangements on the scale of Bretton Woods. It was October 1, 2008, in the immediate throes of the global financial meltdown as Congress was voting on what emergency measures to take. The day before, the Wall Street Journal had asked me to write a commentary, and they published it immediately with the title, "Loose Money and the Roots of the Crisis." You may recall, Greenspan was being widely blamed, demonized, for keeping interest rates too low for too long, even though he had left office more than 2 years earlier. The point I tried to make in my opinion piece was that, look, it's not Greenspan's fault that he was not sufficiently omniscient in managing demand and supply for all forms of money and credit. He wasn't, true. But no one ever was. No one ever could be. The problem was the broken monetary system, which relies on the discretionary judgment of 12 people at the Fed, that puts rule of men over rule of law. So it makes no sense now to blame everything on the former head of the Fed, who had been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, knighted by the British Queen, and inducted into the French Légion d'honneur, because now it looks like he wasn't infallible. How does such an accomplished central banker turn out to be a monetary doofus? That's the question I posed in my opinion piece for the Wall Street Journal. And maybe I was slightly worried about having phrased it precisely that way. So I dashed off an email to Greenspan saying we were with Bob Mundell, wish he could join us in this discussion on possibilities for international monetary reform. And by the way, I added, if the world ever adopts a new global currency system based on gold, I would want you to run it. It's kind of a peace offering. To which he emailed back, "Dear Judy, a gold standard is supposed to run itself. Best regards, Alan." I told you he was witty. And hearing that, Bob Mundell let out a huge laugh and clapped his hands. Now, if I seem to be relating these incidents with a certain lightheartedness, believe me, I take them very seriously. That's why I'm sharing them with you here this evening. I think they tap into the essence of what we are dealing with when we attempt to take our scholarly theories and our policy proposals to the ultimate level of political reality. It was Greenspan who had such a revealing response when he was asked on Fox Business News in October 2007, during that interim period after he'd stepped down as Fed chairman, but well before the global financial crisis had hit full bore. Greenspan was asked by the interviewer, "Why do we need a central bank?" Greenspan lifted his eyebrows and responded, "Well, the question is a very interesting one. We have at this particular stage a fiat money, which is essentially money printed by a government, and it's usually a central bank, which is authorized to do so. Some mechanism has got to be in place that restricts the amount of money which is produced, either a gold standard or currency board or something of that nature, because unless you do that, all of history suggests that inflation will take hold with very deleterious effects on economic activity." Greenspan ended the interview by saying, quote, "There are numbers of us, myself included, who strongly believe that we did very well in the 1870 to 1914 period with an international gold standard." So, taking into consideration the views of Greenspan and Volcker, and particularly Robert Mundell, who won his Nobel Prize for Economics in 1999, 23 years after Milton Friedman won his, I would have thought that there would be sufficient intellectual awareness out there that it's not only okay, but advisable to examine the workings of gold-linked monetary systems from the past and try to apply those lessons to the future. I thought after the disastrous financial collapse of 2008, it should be fairly obvious, especially to economists, that we need serious reform of the monetary system. Jacques de Larosière, who was the head of the Banque de France and who ran the International Monetary Fund from 1978 to 1987, this is a man who's one of the most respected monetary authorities in Europe. He's now in his 90s. Jacques says what we have today, with central banks targeting inflation and buying up sovereign debt with no rules in place and deliberate currency depreciation, that it's worse than a non-system, it's an anti-system. He's right. But what I have learned, somewhat painfully, is that serious reform of global monetary arrangements is impossible until it becomes inevitable. You know, when Milton Friedman first suggested in the early 1950s that permitting flexible rates might provide a viable way to deal with the changing values of national currencies, his voice was almost alone among economists. By his own assessment, probably not more than 5% of the specialists on monetary and international trade issues would have supported the idea of substantially greater exchange rate flexibility at the time. But when the Bretton Woods fixed rate system came under pressure in the late 1960s, people in the academic community, and more importantly on Capitol Hill and in the administration, started to come around to Milton Friedman's way of thinking. The ideological appeal of an invisible hand governing the exchange rates between currencies seemed far preferable to the awkward responses of central banks to every currency crisis. So we went to floating rates. The price of oil shot up. Big international banks recycled all that money from Middle Eastern oil suppliers to Latin America. Remember the words of Walt Wriston, chairman of Citibank? Countries don't go bankrupt. Well, they do. The price of gold soared. We had global recession, a gyrating dollar, inflation. Remember President Ford's win buttons, whip inflation now. Then President Carter, stagnation, malaise. Let's fast forward to 1980 and President Reagan. Reagan, as I mentioned, believed in the gold standard. He once cut a campaign commercial in which he stated, "We'll never regain price stability until we restore some form of gold backing to the dollar." Now, that commercial was never aired. The monetarists, headed by Friedman, were whispering in the ears of Reagan's economic team. The person who knows the most about the Gold Commission set up under Reagan in 1981 is Stanley Stillman, who so kindly and compellingly introduced me. Stanley could describe in detail the valiant efforts of Lou Lehrman and Ron Paul in dissenting from the floating rate advocates. Let me just say, for now, that I had my own differences with Milton. We both had the title of Senior Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. His office was on the floor just below and down the hall, literally steps away. I have some cherished letters from Milton Friedman in small type, single space, wherein he assured me he intended no malice or ill feeling, but he regretted that I should be going down a dead end by recommending anything like Bretton Woods, a pegged exchange rate system, because you absolutely cannot trust governments to maintain it. They refuse to remove trade barriers. That was his attitude. And these are good points, worthy of debate. Debating such things, that's what scholars do. Some of the best debates were between Milton Friedman and Bob Mundell, arguing about fixed versus floating exchange rates in that great series published in the National Post. Well, during my nomination process, some of you might have noticed, a number of articles were published by my detractors, flaunting the news that Milton Friedman, the patron saint of conservatives, had publicly criticized my views in an article he had written. And it's true. This had happened in 1994, a time that coincided with that 50-year anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference. Right around the same time, I'd met with Paul Volcker, who told me he always assumed we would do the necessary adjustments to get the world back on a Bretton Woods-type gold exchange system. My book, Money Meltdown, had just come out, and the Wall Street Journal had published a commentary I wrote on the need for stable exchange rates in order to have a level monetary playing field for free trade. So all of this was quite topical. Well, here's the deal with Milton. In my concluding paragraph in the journal piece, I started by saying, until the U.S. begins standing up once more for stable exchange rates as the starting point for free trade. And Milton took just that beginning part of my sentence and wrote in his article, "It would be hard to pack more error into so few words." And that's what my detractors wrote gleefully when they used that comment from Milton Friedman to heap disdain on me as a Fed nominee with my crazy right-wing fringe ideas about gold. But here's the part that bothers me, I admit, insofar as the intellectual dishonesty we're dealing with out there. Milton's very next sentence was never mentioned. Not one citation of Milton Friedman that was used against me and used specifically to malign the radical notion that gold could have any kind of monetary role. Somehow these pundits neglected to read the rest of Friedman's paragraph. Here is what Milton actually wrote. In a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed piece recommending a return to gold, Judy Shelton started her concluding paragraph, until the U.S. begins standing up once more for stable exchange rates as a starting point for free trade, ... It would be hard to pack more error into so few words. A true gold standard, a unified currency, is indeed consistent with free trade. That's what Milton Friedman wrote. That's what he said next. A true gold standard, a unified currency, is indeed consistent with free trade, but a system of pegged exchange rates, such as the original IMF system or the European monetary system, is an enemy to free trade. Surprise! Milton Friedman, the man who talked Washington into going to floating rates, did not like the Bretton Woods system. And we know why. He thought it relied too much on unreliable politicians and on central bankers influenced by unreliable politicians. But Friedman had immediately asserted that a true gold standard, a unified currency, is indeed consistent with free trade. Now, how did all those editorial writers and columnists, and even a few economists with a certain political agenda, somehow miss that? Friedman ends up saying in his article that Nixon's hand was forced to close the gold window in 1971, and concludes by stating, quote, "The lesson is that for any group of economic entities to have a unified currency, there can be, at most, one independent central bank. At most, because with a pure commodity standard, for example, a gold standard, no central bank is needed." Unquote. Voila! It's just what Alan Greenspan said in that email that caused Mundell to clap his hands with joy. Well, I'm glad to get that off my chest. It's really nice to be among friends here. And by the way, a few days ago, I found that old, torn, yellowed copy of the 1994 article I wrote for the Journal. And here's the rest of my own sentence in that closing paragraph. Until the U.S. begins standing up once more for stable exchange rates as a starting point for free trade, the rest of the world can look forward to continued turmoil in currency and financial markets, and that debilitating sense of economic uneasiness that the architects of the post-World War II economic order sought so diligently to avoid. Period. End of article. And you won't be surprised to hear me say that I still stand by that. But why am I telling you these war stories? Why am I highlighting the tensions between theory and reality? Why am I warning about the high reputational stakes involved and the powerful interests? Because it is a war. It's a war of ideas, at times a brutal one. Monetary reform is not for sissies. In closing, let me compliment you once again, all of you who have been involved in bringing your new book to fruition. It will provide an invaluable reference and will prove to be a compelling resource for those willing to continue the battle of ideas. The American Institute for Economic Research is on the front line with its release, but I think you know that, and you welcome the fight, as do I. Your great founder, E.C. Harwood, wrote something that really struck me about the choice between having a system that embraces individual freedom versus one that looks to the sheltering arms of an all-powerful state. He commented disparagingly about rising government intervention and management of the nation's money credit mechanism with all its distortions, and wrote, "If men are to choose wisely among possible economic alternatives, they must be free to buy and sell at prices agreed among themselves without government intervention, subsidies, or controls. They must be free to select, hold, and exchange the money or standard of value that they deem most suitable for the purpose, with men's customs and views as they are, the gold standard must be restored, and such abuses of the monetary system as inflation must be eliminated. You do him proud with the publication of the gold standard, Retrospect and Prospect. Thank you all for listening. I'm happy to answer questions in our remaining time.